I had a great professor for constitutional law, Professor Robert E. Cushman. The 50s were not a great time for the United States. There was an enormous Red Scare in the country, stirred up by Senator Joe McCarthy, who saw a communist in every corner. Professor Cushman wanted me to understand that the United States was straying from its most basic values, that is, the right to think, speak, and write freely without big brother government telling you what's the right way to think or the right way to speak or write. So I was working as Professor Cushman's research assistant, and he had me follow the news to see who were the latest people in the entertainment industry who were blacklisted, and then to read transcripts of hearings before the House Un-American Activities Committee or the Senate Internal Security Committee. And from those transcripts, I saw that there were lawyers standing up for these people, reminding our Congress that we have a First Amendment guaranteeing free speech, and we have a Fifth Amendment guarantee against self-incrimination. So I thought that that was a pretty good thing to do, that a lawyer could have a professional career, could have a paid job, and volunteer services in bad times to help make things a little better. That's when I had the idea that I would like to be a lawyer. It was a tax case. Marty came into the bedroom where I worked and said, "Ruth, I think you should read this decision." And my response was, "Marty, you know that I don't read tax cases." He said, "Read this one." And I did. It was the story of a man who was never married. He took care of his then 93-year-old mother, and he took what the Internal Revenue Code allowed as a babysitter's deduction, which you could take for the care of an elderly, infirm relative of any age. So he took this $600 deduction, and he was audited by the IRS, and they said, "You can't take that deduction." He said, "Oh, I've been told that there's an elder care, just like there's a baby care." The people who qualified for the deduction were any woman or a widowed or divorced man. Charles E. Moritzv was a never married man. He took his case to the tax court pro se. He represented himself, and he filed a brief, which was a model. No lawyer would have done such a thing, but it was just right. He said, "If I had been a dutiful daughter, I would get this deduction. I'm a dutiful son. This makes no sense." And the tax court judge, in his opinion, said, "Oh, I glean that the taxpayer is making a constitutional argument." But the next words were to the effect, "Everyone knows that the Internal Revenue Code is immune from constitutional attack." So Marty, so as soon as I read that decision, I said, "Marty, let's take it." And that's how Charles E. Moritzv became our client. I call the Moritzv brief the grandparent brief. First, I understood the likely reception to my argument, and that is gender-based discrimination, what was then called sex-based discrimination. What are you talking about? Women have the best of all possible worlds. Think of jury duty. Yes, we don't put them on the jury rolls, but if they want to serve, they can go to the clerk's office and sign up, and we will add them. So they don't have to serve. Women are on a pedestal. They are sheltered. They are protected. And men have to go out into the large, cold world and earn a living. The laws, the statutes, both state and federal, reflected that difference. A good name for it is the separate spheres mentality. The sphere of earning bread, supporting the family, that was the man's world. And the women's world, women were to take care of the house and raise the children, that dichotomy. And the laws were shaped to fit that. That's why any woman could get the deduction in Charles E. Moritz's case, because women, it was well known, could take care of incapacitated relatives, no matter what the age. But men, in fact, that was one of the arguments the government made in Moritz, that he hadn't proved that he was capable of taking care of his mother, so that the babysitter was a substitute for himself. Women wouldn't not have to prove that, because everybody knows that women could take care of elderly parents. So what we needed to show was that the image of women being on a pedestal, there was something wrong with that picture. And that, in fact, as Justice Brennan put it years later, the pedestal all too often turned out to be a cage. The woman couldn't get out. She was locked in. So it was to try to promote the understanding that these so-called protective laws more often than not ended up restricting what women could do, sparing men's jobs from women's competition. So how to say that in a polite way to get across the picture, that was the challenge. The question is often asked to me by the school groups that visit the court, did you always want to be a Supreme Court justice? Or more modestly, did you always want to be a judge? And I laugh because in the days that I went to law school, only one woman in the history of the United States had ever been a federal appeals court judge. She was Florence Allen, Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. She stepped down in 1959, the year I graduated from law school, and then there were none again. So if you were a realist, as a woman, you knew that chances for a federal judgeship were slim to none. I never thought about becoming a judge until Jimmy Carter became president. And Jimmy Carter did something wonderful. He looked around at the federal judiciary and he observed, you know, they all look like me. They were all white men of a certain age. But, he added, that's not the way the great United States looks. I want my judges to reflect the greatness of the people of the United States in all their diversity. So, I will appoint members of minority groups and women, not as one-at-a-time curiosities like Florence Allen, but in numbers. So then, for the first time, I thought, yes, I would like to be a judge. Now, I'd spent 10 years litigating gender discrimination cases. I'd been a teacher, law teacher for 17 years. I thought it might be kind of nice to be part of the decision-making process. But that was before 1977. No woman who was a realist ever aspired to a federal judgeship. And then what Carter did, he appointed, I think, over 25 women to federal trial courts, to the federal district court bench, and then 11 of us to the courts of appeals, and I was one of the lucky 11. Had just come in from, I was in Vermont for a wedding, and the White House counsel, Bernie Nussbaum, said, well, come meet the president. don't worry that you're in your travel clothes. He will be coming in off the golf course. So when I came to the White House and the president walked in, he was not in his golf clothes. He was in his Sunday best. He'd just come back from church. So I was kind of embarrassed by the way I looked. Savannah Redding was a 13-year-old girl. She was in the 8th grade. And she was suspected of having given pills to a classmate. And the pills turned out to be Advil. But Savannah was taken to the girls' bathroom and strip searched. And then when the strip search was over and they found no pills, she was made to sit in a chair outside the principal's office for 2 hours till they called her mother and said, pick her up. And her mother was infuriated. And she sued the school district for humiliating her daughter that way. And the question was, had the school district violated her civil rights? The court answered yes to that question, but the next question is, should there be damages? Because the principal should have known that this behavior was unlawful. And the court said, no damages. The principal is cloaked with immunity because we have never had a case like this before, so he didn't know. He didn't know that what was done was unlawful. And that's when I said, anyone who reads the Fourth Amendment protecting us against unreasonable searches and seizures, humiliating that 13-year-old girl in that way was the most unreasonable search. There were jokes about the boys in the locker room and the boys unclothed in front of each other. Nobody thought anything of it. And that's, I think I said it from the bench, that 13 is a vulnerable age for a girl. And a 13-year-old girl is not like a 13-year-old boy. This is an overwhelming humiliation for her. And I think when I said something to that effect, then the jokes stopped. There were no more jokes about the boys in the locker room. I suppose my colleagues thought of their daughters, thought of their wives, and realized that the point I was making was well taken. The Chief Justice could have announced the decision, but I remembered to my pancreatic cancer surgery. I was home and recuperating for about 2 weeks while the court was not sitting, and then the court went back to sit. And I told Marty, I can't do this. I won't be able to sit still for 2 hours listening to arguments. And he said, yes, you will. And it was because of the strength that he gave me that I showed up in court that morning. And I think, and miraculously, I was able to sit still. So I thought, what would Marty want me to do? And that's why I came to the court and read the summary of my decision from the bench. I found this letter in the drawer of the stand next to Marty's bed in the hospital. When we knew it was the end and I was taking him home so that he could die at home rather than in the hospital, I was just checking to see that we had everything he brought with him. And on a yellow pad, there was a letter to me. And it reads, "My dearest Ruth, you are the only person I have loved in my life, setting aside a bit parents and kids and their kids. And I have admired and loved you almost since the day we first met at Cornell, some 56 years ago. It was wrong about 56, it was nearly 60 years. We were married for 56 years. What a treat it has been to watch you progress to the very top of the legal world. I will be in Johns Hopkins Medical Center until Friday, June 25th, I believe. And between then and now, I shall think hard on my remaining health and life, and consider on balance the time has come for me to toughen out or to take leave of life, because the loss of quality now simply overwhelms. I hope you will support where I come out, but I understand you may not. I will not love you a jot less." And just sign Marty. There were no lawyers in my family. My father came to the United States from Russia when he was 13, and apart from night school to learn English, he had no formal schooling. My mother was the sixth child to be born in her large family, and the first one born in the USA. She was born 4 months after her parents arrived from Austria, and she was a very good student. She graduated high school at age 15 and then went immediately to work so that she could help support the eldest son, who was going to Cornell University. In those families, the eldest son was the one on whom most attention was lavished, and no one thought about sending girls to higher education. I think my mother would have thrived had she worked, but when she was married, it was considered a disgrace to a man if his wife worked. It would mean that he was unable to support her. So she stopped working when she married, but she was always helpful to my father in his work. In fact, when she died when I was 17, just before I was to graduate from high school. When she died, his business went downhill because she was a very important part of keeping it afloat. My mother was a voracious reader, and one gift that she gave me was loving to read. My favorite memory was sitting on her lap. She would read books to me. We had a weekly excursion to the public library, and she would leave me in the library in the children's section, have her hair done, and then pick me up when I had my 3 or 4 books for the week. I think that most girls who grew up when I did were very fond of the Nancy Drew series, not because they were well written, they weren't, but because this was a girl who was an adventurer, who could think for herself, who was the dominant person in her relationship with her young boyfriend. So the Nancy Drew series made girls feel good, that they could be achievers, and they didn't have to take a back seat or be wallflowers. So the Nancy Drew series was important to me. When I was even younger, I loved mythology. I loved Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Cornell in the early 50s was considered a great school for girls because there were 4 men to every woman. It was a strict quota system, and that meant the women were ever so much smarter than the boys. But it wasn't the thing to do to show how smart you were. It was much better that you gave the impression that you weren't working at all, that you were a party girl. So I did my studying in various bathrooms on the campus. Then when I went back to the dormitory, I didn't have homework to do. He was a man who was in love with the sound of words, and he would read aloud from the books that were assigned and showed us how a writer could paint pictures with words and how important having the right word in the right place would be. He gave an example of why he liked writing in the English language. I'm not sure that his first language was Russian. It may have been French. But the example that he gave was, if you're speaking French and you want to refer to a white horse, so you say, le cheval blanc. First you see the horse, and horse stimulates brown in your mind. Then you have to readjust it with white. But in English, white comes before horse, so you see the white horse immediately. And that was the kind of thing that was important to Nabokov. He was a marvelous teacher, wonderfully amusing. My mother-in-law's advice, which she gave me on the day of our wedding. We were married in Marty's home, and his mother took me into the bedroom, her bedroom, and said, "Dear, I'd like to tell you the secret of a happy marriage." Yes? What is the secret? It helps sometimes to be a little deaf. And I found that advice, it stood me in very good stead, not only in a wonderful marriage that lasted well over half a century, but in every workplace I've served, dealing with my faculty colleagues when I was a law teacher, and even now with my colleagues on the Supreme Court. When an unkind word is said, a thoughtless word, best to tune out. The 9 of us were greeted by the dean, Dean Aaron Griswold, at a dinner he held in his home. He invited the 9 women, and each of us had a faculty escort. My escort was Herbert Wexler, later my colleague at Columbia. He was a man who looked more like God than anyone I'd ever seen. I was totally taken with him, but intimidated because he was so brilliant. Anyway, we had a meal. It was not a memorable meal, and there was no wine because the dean was a teetotaler. And then he had the chairs in his living room arranged in a semicircle and asked each of us in turn to say what we were doing at the Harvard Law School, occupying a seat that could be held by a man. And most of us were embarrassed by the question. But years later, when the dean became a friend, I realized what he was trying to do. The dean was not known for his sense of humor. Harvard didn't admit women until 1950-51, was the first year the law school admitted women. There were still doubting Thomases on the faculty. And the dean wanted to be armed with stories from the women themselves about what they would do with a law degree. So that's why he asked the question. Of course, the women in my class didn't exactly comprehend that at the time. But one of them gave him a perfect answer. Mine was far from perfect. But this was Flora Schnall. She had a distinguished career as a lawyer. She said, Dean Griswold, there are 9 of us. Well, really, Ruth Ginsburg doesn't count for this purpose. So there are 8. And there are over 500 of them. What better place to find a man? And the dean, I think, was horrified by that answer, but she was the only one who treated it with the way it should have been treated. For the most part, my professors treated the women in the class fairly. There was no such thing as Ladies' Day in any of my classes. Ladies' Day was notorious in law schools. It was the day when only women were called on, and the rest of the year they were ignored. I did not have that experience, but I did have this experience. The 9 of us were divided into 4 sections. So that meant most of us were in a room with just one other woman. If we were called on, we worried that if we failed, if we didn't give the right answer, we would be failing not just for ourselves, but for all women. It's somewhat similar to people saying when a car takes a wrong turn, what would you expect? It's a woman driver. So we were on our toes. We were always well prepared. And years later, when women were beginning to come to law school in numbers in the 1970s, I was then teaching at Columbia, and one of my colleagues said that he really longed for the good old days when there were few women in the class, because he said if things were going slowly and you needed a crisp, right answer, you called on the woman. She was always prepared. She would give you the right answer, and then the class could move along. But nowadays, he said, there's no difference. The women are as unprepared as the men. We never thought about the possibility, or never talked about the possibility that he might not survive. We were concentrating on getting him through the 3rd year. And by the way, Marty went to classes for only 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks of the semester. In that semester, he got the highest grades that he ever got in law school because he had the best tutors. And Harvard was known as a competitive place. My experience was the opposite. His classmates, my classmates, rallied around the 2 of us, and he got individual tutorials to help prepare him for the exams. How did I get through it? Well, I was able to get by with very little sleep. Because of the radiation, Marty couldn't ingest anything till midnight. And so between midnight and 2, he had dinner, my bad hamburger usually, And then he would dictate to me his senior paper. And then he'd go back to sleep, and it was about 2 o'clock. Then I'd take out the books and start reading what I needed to read to be prepared for classes the next day. Justice Frankfurter, like his colleagues, was just not prepared to hire a woman. These were pre-Title VII days, so there was nothing unlawful about discriminating against women. And gentlemen of a certain age at that time felt that they would be discomforted by a woman in chambers, that they might have to watch what they say. They might have to censor their speech. It was surprising that Frankfurter had that typical in those days reaction, because he was the first justice to hire an African American as a law clerk some years before. But as I said, like many other federal judges of the time, he just wasn't prepared to hire a woman. Judge Learnhand was a brilliant jurist, and I wanted to clerk for him more than anything, even more than for a Supreme Court justice. And my judge, Judge Edmund Palmieri, lived around the corner from Judge Hand and would drive Judge Hand into work and back. And whenever I was finished early enough, I would join them on that ride. I'd sit in the back of the car. And this great man would say anything that came into his head. He sang songs at the top of his lungs. He used words that I never heard. And I asked him, Judge Hand, I don't seem to inhibit your speech when you're in this car. Why won't you consider me as a law clerk? And he said, young lady, I am not looking at you. For men of that time, of that age, you didn't use bad language in front of a lady. When I applied for law firm jobs, Columbia had an excellent placement office, but sign-up sheets would go up, and many would say men only. I had, as I have sometimes explained, 3 strikes that put me out when it came to employment as a lawyer. One is I'm Jewish, and the law firms were just beginning to stop their anti-discriminatory. They're discriminatory. The law firms were just beginning to stop discriminating on the basis of religion. And that affected Catholics as well as Jews. They were opening up to all people without regard to religion. And some, a precious few, were ready to try a woman, but none were willing to take a chance on a mother. And my daughter was 4 years old when I graduated from law school. So of course I was disappointed, but it wasn't unexpected. I read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex the first summer I was in Sweden, and I was observing a society that was more advanced than we were in recognizing women's talent and capacities. At that time, 1962, women were less than 3% of the law students in the United States. They were already 20% in Sweden. There was a woman writing a column in the Stockholm Daily paper to this effect: why should the woman have 2 jobs and the man only 1. In Sweden, it was already not only accepted but expected that there would be 2 earner families. Inflation was high, and if you wanted to do well by your children, you needed 2 incomes. But she was expected to have dinner on the table at 7, buy the children's new shoes, take them for the medical checkups, and the rest. And this columnist, whose name was Eva Moberg, her question was, shouldn't he do more than take out the garbage? And there were many, many people talking about that. So I was listening to these conversations at the same time as I was reading The Second Sex, which is an eye-opener. She shows between the differences between the way women are treated, the way men are treated, and it doesn't inevitably have to be that way. There were some societies that she commented on where the woman is the queen bee. That was a wonderful thing that happened because Marty was told after all that radiation that it would be impossible for us to have a second child. So that was very good news. But there was no amniocentesis at the time, and we didn't know what James would turn out to be. But in any event, I was at that time, it was my second year at Rutgers. I had a year-to-year contract. And I was pretty sure that if I told them I was pregnant, I wouldn't get a contract for the next year. So I wore my mother-in-law's clothes. It was just right. She was 1 size larger. And I got through the spring semester. When I had the new contract in hand, I told my colleagues when I came back in the fall there would be 1 more in our family. So they stopped thinking that I was gaining a lot of weight. The women's movement came alive in the United States in the late 60s. And the government in those days was heavily into affirmative action. People don't remember that affirmative action became a major item during Nixon's administration. And it started in the construction trades, which were highly exclusionary. There was a good deal of nepotism, so you got a starting job as an apprentice if your father, your uncle, was a member of the union. And it was Nixon's Secretary of Labor who thought that the best way to break that exclusion was to have people who have contracts with government, and many people do, pledge to do 2 things. One was to set goals and timetables. The assumption was, now let's assume there would be no discrimination. About how many members of a minority group might be expected. So you set that number as the goal and a timetable for when you would achieve it. And this was not something that was absolute. If there was a good reason why you couldn't comply, so be it. But it was necessary for people who held government contracts at least to make an effort. And most colleges and universities had government money of some sort. There was a very active Office for Civil Rights in the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And the head of that office was a man named Stan Pottinger. He was visiting colleges and universities all over America to encourage them to fulfill their affirmative action obligations, and also to remind them that if they didn't, there was a possibility that their contracts might be suspended or even terminated. So in the year 1972, Columbia named 2 people to the faculty. One was an African-American man, and one was a woman, the first ever hired in a tenured post.
That was you.
Yes. I had a great deal of support from my faculty colleagues. None of them were resentful. Most of them were so secure about themselves and the excellence of the Columbia faculty. Their idea was that if Columbia decided to engage me to be a tenured professor, then I must be really good. And even if I was doing things that they would disagree with, they were backing me up. One example, I was named the law school's representative on the university senate. Women who were teaching in the university had a suspicion that they were not getting equal pay. So the start to finding out if that suspicion was right was finding out just what salaries the university was paying, and the administration's answer was, that's secret information. All kinds of jealousies would result if we published them. And of course, you couldn't find out if Columbia was meeting its equal pay obligations without that information, which we eventually got, and the suspicions proved right. The hardest thing for my colleagues to accept was when we, and by we I mean the ACLU Women's Rights Project, which I helped to found, challenged the TIA craft program and the retirement program used by most colleges and universities because they rigidly separated the policy beneficiaries by sex. So they used mortality tables for men, for women, and the women would get less than when they retired than a man with equivalent salary and time in service. The reason was that on average it's fair because women on average live longer than men. And my view was, yes, that's certainly true on average, but there are some men who live long and some women who die early. And the whole notion is that you don't lump together women simply because they are women, and that TIA craft should merge their mortality tables. Well, the immediate response was horrors. We just couldn't do that. Then all the men would desert the plan and get private insurance. Well, TIA craft was such a good deal that when they did finally merge the tables, nobody left. But that was the most worrisome thing to my faculty colleagues. Even so, they supported a class action that was brought with 100 named plaintiffs on behalf of women teachers and administrators at Columbia, charging that maintaining separate mortality tables essentially denied women equal pay and was in violation of our foremost anti-discrimination law, Title VII. I was fortunate to be born at the right time and to be in the right place when the women's movement came alive. So many things were wrong with the way life was ordered in the 70s. In many states, women didn't serve on juries, to take just one example. And there were so many jobs that were off limit to women. People began to realize there was something wrong about that. And women should be free to aspire and achieve just as men are. So I had legal education, and I could use that education to help move this movement for change, for allowing women to realize their full potential, help move that along. So it was that 10 years of my life that I devoted to litigating cases about, I don't say women's rights, I say the constitutional principle of the equal citizenship stature of men and women. I was tremendously fortunate to be able to participate in that movement for change. Stephen Weisenfeld's wife died in childbirth. She had been a school teacher. She earned slightly more than he did. When she died, Stephen went to the Social Security office. He thought that if he worked part-time, up to the ceiling that Social Security allowed you to earn, the Social Security benefits plus what he could earn on top of that, he could just about make it and take care of his child and not go to work full-time till the child was in school a full day. So he went to the Social Security office and asked for what he was told were child in care benefits. And he was told, "We're very sorry, Mr. Weisenfeld. Those are mother's benefits. They're not available to fathers." So he was the person who immediately felt the effect of the law. But where did that discrimination begin? It began with the woman as wage earner. Women paid the same Social Security tax that men paid, but it didn't net for their family the same protection. Same tax, but unequal protection. So we could say, Stephen Weisenfeld is feeling the effect of this discrimination, but it began with his wife, the wage earner, who was not treated as a full wage earner. She was a woman wage earner, and that meant she was secondary, she was earning pin money, no Social Security benefits for her family when she dies. So the woman was discriminated against as wage earner, the male as parent. And that conformed to what was the basic separation, that the man was the breadwinner, the woman was responsible for care of the home and children. So again, we never challenged how life was for most people. We said that stereotypes, that's why they are stereotypes, are true in general, but there are many people who don't fit the mold. And the whole object in the 1970s, through first public education, then attempt to change the laws by going to the state legislatures and Congress, and finally the courts were there as a last resort. The idea, I think, was best expressed in a song that Ms. Magazine published. And I think it was Marlo Thomas was involved. The song is "Free to Be You and Me." And that was the idea that whether you're male or female, you should be free to follow your star, to develop your talent, and you shouldn't be held back by artificial barriers. Hours legislation said women couldn't work more than 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. And that might have been fine in the days of sweatshops when some employers required women to work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. But over the years, especially with unions protecting workers, the workday shrunk from 12 hours to 10 hours to 8. And then if an employer wanted more hours, the employer would have to pay time and a half or double time for those additional hours. So the hours laws that started out to protect women from sweatshop conditions ended up protecting men's jobs from women's competition. If an employer has two choices, a woman who cannot be engaged to work overtime and a man who is willing to do that, you pick the man. So the protections over time, it came to be not protections, but barriers for women. To take another simple example, women couldn't be engaged to work at night, no night work. Well, if a woman is a waitress, the most lucrative tips at banquets and such come in the evening, not at lunchtime. So women came to realize that these old-style protections were not genuine protections for women, but they helped to keep things the way they were, where there was this sharp divide between what women do and what men do. And the notion was to break down those stereotypes. So if a man wants to go to a nursing school, then that's okay, that's fine. And if a woman wants to be an engineer, a doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, that's fine too. And now it's not at all extraordinary for a woman to be any of those things. The near case, Craig against Bourne. Well, when we started out, there were 2 levels of review of cases that relied on the equal protection principle. And one level was the highest. It was labeled strict scrutiny. It was reserved for discrimination on the basis of race. Everyone knew that racial discrimination was odious, should not be permitted. So a racial classification that adversely affected the minority race got this high level of review, was looked at very suspiciously. Everything else, the test was rational basis, which some people said, rational basis, all you have to do to get a law accepted by the Supreme Court is pass the lunatic test. If it isn't lunatic, then it's okay. Then Congress has the authority to do that. We needed to ratchet up that level. And incidentally, I looked at all of the Supreme Court cases involving equal protection and was able to get out some phrases here and there that suggested a higher level of review, something more than the lunatic test. So our object was to ratchet up the review standard for gender-based discrimination. It was interesting that in the Turning Point case, Reed, the court didn't mention that it was doing something new. That the law in question, yes, it would have passed the rational basis test, but they held it was no good. This was a law of the state of Idaho that said, as between persons equally entitled to administer a decedent's estate, males must be preferred to females. Simple as that. And the rival contenders in that case was Sally Reed and Cecil Reed. They had a teenage son. They were divorced. When the boy was what the law calls of tender years, when he was young, the mother had custody. When the boy reached his teens, the father said, now he needs to be prepared for a man's world, so I should be the custodian. Sally didn't like that idea at all, but she objected in vain. Sadly, she turned out to be right. The boy, living with his father, became terribly depressed, and one day took out one of his father's many guns and committed suicide. So Sally wanted to be appointed administrator of his estate. She couldn't. Why? Males must be preferred to females. Why would we have such a law? Because in the ancient days, in the 19th century, before the Married Women's Property Acts were passed, women, if they married, couldn't sue and be sued. They couldn't make contracts in their own name. They couldn't hold property in their own name. So if you had a choice between two people to be the administrator of the decedent's estate, of course you'd pick the competent person, the one who can make contracts, the one who can hold property, the one who can sue and be sued. That's why there were such laws on the books. I was afraid I wouldn't hold down whatever I had. I was terribly nervous. I had a great first sentence prepared in advance, well memorized, but I was, nervous is an understatement. But then I had this moment when I looked up at the bench and thought to myself, these are the most important judges in the United States, and I have a captive audience. They have no place to go. They have to listen to me. And so then I switched to my teacher mode. And I dealt with them. I told them things that they hadn't thought about how the pedestal often turns out to be a cage. My son was a lively child. I called him lively. His teachers called him hyperactive. And I would get calls, at least once a month, to please come down to the school to meet with the room teacher or the school psychologist or the principal to hear about my son's latest escapade. And one day I was at my office in Columbia, very tired because I had stayed up all night writing a brief. And I got the call. And this time I said, this child has two parents. Please alternate calls. And this time it's his father's turn. So Marty went down to the school. He left his law office, met with the three stone faces who disclosed my son's latest offense. What did he do? He stole the elevator. It was a handheld elevator. The elevator operator, in those days people were still smoking, the operator went out to have a cigarette, and one of my son's classmates dared him to take a group of kindergartners up to the top floor in the elevator, which he did. So Marty's response on being told that your son stole the elevator was, how far could he take it? So I don't know whether it was Marty's wonderful sense of humor or the reluctance of the school to call a father away from his work. But then we got the calls barely once a semester, although there was no quick change in James's behavior. The people were much more reluctant to take a man away from his work than a woman. it was very difficult for him, but I think he sensed that what was going on with those restrictions, they were severe restrictions that it was a sham to say they protected women's health. What they did was make access to abortion almost impossible for many poor women, or access to a safe abortion, thus driving them to back alley abortionists the way it was in the not so good old days. So I thought that the court recognizing that that kind of legislation simply would not pass constitutional review was very important. I think both the affirmative action decision and the whole women's health case, the access to abortion, they kind of quieted the turmoil that was going on. How was the court going to rule, this way or that way? I think for the nonce, we will not have any major cases in either field because the court spoke. I think both decisions were excellent, very well reasoned, and will be accepted. She was almost like a big sister to me. Sandra Day O'Connor is a truly great woman. When I came on board, she told me just what I needed to know to be able to manage those first weeks. She didn't douse me with a whole bunch of stuff that I couldn't possibly retain. At so many stages of my life, she gave me good counsel. When I had colorectal cancer, Sandra had had breast cancer. She had massive surgery. She was in court hearing argument 9 days after her surgery. So her advice to me was, Ruth, you're having chemotherapy, schedule it for Friday, so then by Monday you'll be over it. You'll be over the bad effects. That's how she was. Anything that came her way, she would deal with it. She would just do it. The Virginia Military Institute is a fine school. It offers an incredible opportunity, but it limited that opportunity to men. There were women who were ready, willing, and able to go through that arduous training. What they wanted more than anything else was the kind of old boy network. The VMI alums are very loyal. They try to help the graduates on the way. And I think only about 15% of VMI graduates end up with military careers. The rest are in business and commerce. So it was an important opportunity that was not open to women, and there was nothing comparable for them. I wanted to write the decision. By the way, the name of the case is revealing. It was United States against Virginia. It was the United States government that was suing the state of Virginia, saying, state of Virginia, you can't offer an educational opportunity to one sex only. I was rather low on the totem pole. In fact, I did get the assignment because Justice O'Connor said Ruth should write this case. I think she had considerable seniority then, and so she would have been the logical person to get the assignment, but she said I should write it. He came into my chambers with what he said was the penultimate draft of his dissent in the VMI case. He said he wasn't quite ready to circulate it to the court. It needed more polishing, but the term was getting on toward the end, and he wanted to give me as much time as he possibly could to answer his dissent. I was about to go off to my circuit judicial conference. I took the opinion draft with me. I started reading it on the plane to Albany, And it was, even for Scalia, it was a real zinger. it was. And so I spent the whole weekend thinking about how I would, in a restrained and moderate way, answer these comments. I mean, he took me to task for everything. I had a footnote in which I referred to the Charlottesville campus of the University of Virginia. He said, we must excuse this justice, who is probably more familiar with schools in New York where they may have a campus here and a campus there. There is no Charlottesville campus. There is only the University of Virginia, period. The greatest thing for me was to have a Scalia dissent. He would point out all the soft spots, and that would give me an opportunity to improve the opinion, to make it more persuasive than it was before I got this stimulating dissent. It was the day of the same-sex marriage case. Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion for the court. I joined him. Justice Scalia dissented vigorously. That's an understatement. And yet we were all together that evening at this wonderful dinner that Catherine and Wayne Reynolds had. The head of NIH took out his guitar. Renee Fleming began to sing with him, and everybody joined in. So there was Justice Kennedy and Justice Scalia, and I was there too, all singing rather raucously, "The times they are changing." It opens with Scalia's Rage aria. And for those who know music, it's straight out of Handel, real Handelian. And the words are, "The justices are blind. How can they possibly spout this? The Constitution says absolutely nothing about this." And then my answering aria is, "Dear Justice Scalia, you are searching in vain for bright-line solutions to cases that have no easy answers. But the great thing about our Constitution is, like our society, it can evolve." And then the opera switches into a jazz mode, and the singer goes on, "Let it grow, let it grow." How can I describe the American dream? Maybe it's captured by the first stride I took on a New York subway after returning from several months in Sweden, where everybody looked the same. And here I was on the subway, and the amazing diversity of the people of the United States. You know, the motto is E pluribus unum, of many one. And that's the idea that we, more than just tolerating, we can appreciate our differences and yet pull together for the long haul. So that is my idea of the American dream, sometimes referred to as the melting pot. That's not quite right, because we keep our individual identities, but we are all Americans and proud to live in the land of the free. It's obvious now that women are really here, and we're here to stay just as men are. We're not one or two at a time curiosities. So I think this is an exhilarating change. When I was a new justice on this court, for the 12 years that I sat together with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, invariably one lawyer or another would call me Justice O'Connor. Or they had become accustomed to a woman on the court, and Justice O'Connor was the woman. So if they heard a woman's voice, well, that must be the Lady Justice, even though we don't look alike, we don't sound alike. But last year, no one called Justice Sotomayor Justice Ginsburg, or me, Justice Sotomayor, and I'm certain that lawyers will perceive the difference among the three of us, and we will each have our individual identities. We're not quite where the Supreme Court of Canada is. Supreme Court of Canada also has 9 justices. 4 are women, including their Chief Justice. I think we will not be too far behind. The hardest barrier to surmount for most women, I think it's no longer at the entry level of any job, no longer access to any educational facility. I think, for example, that Justice Kagan did not encounter any discrimination in admissions to college, law school, getting a job, getting a clerkship. But what is very hard for most women is what happens when children are born. Will men become equal parents, sharing the joys as well as the burdens of bringing up the next generation? But that's my dream for the world, for every child to have 2 loving parents who share in raising the child. I was fortunate to be born at the right time and to be in the right place when the women's movement came alive. So many things were wrong with the way life was ordered in the 70s. In many states, women didn't serve on juries, to take just one example. And there were so many jobs that were off limit to women. People began to realize there was something wrong about that. And women should be free to aspire and achieve just as men are. So I had legal education, and I could use that education to help move this movement for change, for allowing women to realize their full potential, help move that along. So it was that 10 years of my life that I devoted to litigating cases about, I don't say women's rights, I say the constitutional principle of the equal citizenship stature of men and women. I was tremendously fortunate to be able to participate in that movement for change.